All right. So here we go. We are recording. So welcome everybody to another episode of Agents of Awesome TV. This is the place to be to meet spiritually savvy people who are doing awesome things in the world and making the world a more awesome place. So we have the great pleasure today of welcoming Amir Freimann. Welcome, Amir.
Hello, nice to meet you.
And you. And Amir joins us from Israel today. That's kind of exciting. And I'll tell you a little bit about his bio. And of course, then we're going to dive more deeply into his story. So Amir left medical school at the end of the 5th year of his studies, ooh la la, to seek answers to life's questions. I'm going to ask you about that, Amir, how on earth one leaves medical school at the end of 5th year and what possessed you to do that. He then spent a couple of years in a Zen monastery in Japan and over 20 years in a spiritual community in America. He went back to Israel, where he co-founded the Israeli Education Spirit Movement. We'd love to hear a bit about that too. And has authored and worked and co-authored several books, the newest of which is called Spiritual Transmission, Paradoxes and Dilemmas on the Spiritual Path. And I'm really excited to talk about that today. It's a conversation that doesn't happen enough in spiritual circles, so it's very healthy actually to be discussing this. And right now he is deep diving into a PhD on an area called Living Transcendence. And so we'll find out a bit more from Amir what that means as well.
Right.
So welcome, great. We're going to banter in our dialogue, and perhaps we can start off with medical school and what on earth possessed you to leave 5 years in?
Yes, you're expressing my parents' dismay when they heard about my decision. So you can imagine it didn't go very well with them. But I became interested in, not interested, I became passionately involved in exploration of the big questions, which for me were, who am I, what am I doing here, and what is all this about? When I was about 16 or 17, when I was still in high school, and I think, I realized at that age that nobody around me actually knew the answers to those all-important questions, and everybody was just living their lives, going about their business as if they knew the answers to those questions, but nobody really did. And therefore, that if I wanted to not just pass through life, not knowing what this is all about and what I'm supposed to do with my life, then I had to figure out or find the answers for myself. So I started searching. I didn't know at the time that it was called a spiritual search. You know, I was living on a farm in a village in Israel, and that kind of terminology had not reached Israel at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm 60 now, so that was about 45 years ago. But somehow, miraculously, I don't really understand how, a small booklet of Zen koans fell into my hands about half a year later, and I read it. I understood nothing, but knew that that's the direction I wanted to go. And then the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was translated into Hebrew, so I read that, and I decided, okay, that's what I'm going to do in life. I'm going to ride a motorbike and ask big questions. And,
Fantastic.
it was not that way. I ended up doing a bicycle trip instead of a bike trip because I had no money for a bike. But
good enough.
Yeah, I actually did that after I did my army service. I did 3 months on a bicycle from Rome, Italy to London on a bicycle, which was really the big journey of my life, the big whatever spiritual search kind of expressed in physical form as riding a bicycle on the Alps through the Alps.
Beautiful.
And then when I was 25, I actually took a break from medical school after I finished the first 3 years, which is when you get your first degree. I asked to take a break, and I went for 2 years to a Zen monastery in Japan, and then came back. Thought I'd at least finish my medical studies, and then go back to Japan, continue to practice Zen. But that was not to happen. At the end of the 5th year, and I have to say that these big questions, life questions, were getting more and more. I was getting more and more desperate about the need to solve them. I basically felt that what I was doing at the time, studying and thinking about my career and relationships and all that, was kind of what I do in the meantime until I figure out what this is really all about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I also became desperate because I realized that I could very well spend my whole life doing the in the meantime kind of things without ever finding the answers, which would be a total waste of my life. So, and I felt that was a very real possibility, because look, I had been a seeker and asking those questions and meditating, thousands of hours a year probably, from until I was 29. And I didn't feel I was getting very close to the answers to those questions.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of experiences and all kinds of, extraordinary states and wonderful things. But in terms of knowing directly the answers to those questions, I felt I wasn't making much progress. And I was becoming quite desperate about it. So at the end of the 5th year of my medical studies, a young American teacher by the name of Andrew Cohen, who had just started teaching a few months earlier, was visiting Israel. And a good friend of mine, invited me to come and see him. So he was just 3 years older than me. I was 29, he was 32. And we were meeting, we were just sitting, a small group of people on the floor in a friend's living room. And he said, I'm not a lecturer. I don't have any teaching, to kind of share with you, or anything really structured. But if any of you has a question about life, about spiritual life, about spiritual practice, about enlightenment, time, I'll do my best to try to answer those questions. And in the first evening, I asked him, I said, I've been Andrew, his name was Andrew Cohen, I don't know if I mentioned that, but I said, Andrew, I have been practicing and searching for the answers to the big questions for about 12 years now, and I don't feel I made much progress. Can you tell me why that is? And he looked at me for a few seconds and he said, it's because you're afraid. And I was shocked by that answer. I mean, I was a young Israeli macho, and fear was not part of my vocabulary. I didn't really think that I knew what fear was. So I asked him, what are you talking about? And he said, this is something I'd rather you figure out for yourself. Something I should tell you. It will be much more valuable if you find out for yourself. But if you do, I'd love to hear. Do tell me. And I, for whatever reason, took him very seriously. I was impressed by what he said and by the question that he posed to me. And that night I couldn't fall asleep, and I sat in my bed and I meditated on the question, what am I most afraid of? I mean, I didn't know if I was afraid of anything, so I thought I'd better start with the question, what am I most afraid of? Maybe we'll get somewhere. And at some point during the night, I came to an answer. And the next morning I called him up and I said, Andrew, you asked me, you suggested that I look into what I was afraid of. So I think I came up with something. Can we meet and talk? And he said, yeah, sure, come over. And I came over and I said to him, I realized that the thing I was most afraid of was that I would waste this whole lifetime and die without getting what it's all about. And it would be just a complete waste of my time here. And he became so happy. He just loved that. And he said to me, you have to treasure this fear because it will take you all the way there.
Mm.
And I was very moved by that. I basically felt that he knew exactly what I was talking about, and that that his conviction that it is through my intention and my desperate desire to know the answers to those questions, that's really all I need, and that's all I can count on. And that the more I trust and actually, I would say, surrender to that burning passion to know the answers to those questions, that's what's going to lead me to what I'm looking for.
Mm.
And he was really the first person I met in my life who could, I felt, conveyed such conviction and such trust in my own passion, my own desire to know what this is all about. And that his conviction was not coming from some book that he read or from some belief system, but was coming out of his own experience and his own journey. And really what happened, so I started spending a lot of time with him. He was in Israel for 5 weeks, and I basically went every evening. He was teaching like 5 evenings teaching. He was sitting with people and answering questions and exploring things with people 5 days a week. And then on weekends, he would go traveling around Israel, and I kind of joined him and drove him around, and we spent a lot of time, both informal and informal situations. And I felt that in different ways he expressed that trust, and not just for me, but for anybody who came to him. I felt he really connected with the deepest yearning to know and live according to the meaning of life, discovery of the meaning of life, and as a result of spending all that time with him and the exploration and the, I would say, dynamic that it started in me, the interaction with him. About a month after we started meeting, I had what I call an event of unitive consciousness, which, to my understanding, is what enlightenment is, or enlightenment experience, or mystical experience is about. And that kind of happened to me while I was, in medical school, and on the lawn of the hospital that I was studying in. After 2 years in a Zen, it didn't happen for 2 years in a Zen monastery, and then it happened at the medical school. And
of course.
Yeah, These things cannot really be scheduled to will. And then I thought, well, a few things became clear to me in that, I don't know, in that or following that event of unitive consciousness. One of which was that Andrew had always been and would forever be my teacher, and that I had always known that, but it took me meeting him in person and spending time with him for my mind to catch up with that knowledge. And that was one thing that became clear to me. And the other was that that if I wanted that event to not just remain as an experience that happened to me at, on Wednesday at 12 o'clock, I had to respond to it with everything I've got. And the more I give of myself, in whatever ways it meant, the more fully I respond and want to make that experience the foundation of my new life, the more meaningful it will be in my life, and the more my life will be transformed. So Living Medical School was kind of course, that's kind of one way I can respond, meaning Living Medical School so that I can give myself fully to the continued exploration of what it means now to live a life based on the experience of unitive consciousness. So that's why I left medical school. That's why I then went and met and spoke with Andrew. And I said, I'd love to come and be with you. He was in England at the time, traveling around. So I said, I feel that, I can learn a lot more from you, and may I join you? And he said, sure. And so that's how it happened. And something, I knew it was completely crazy. It was 1 year before finishing medical school.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody from my parents to the student's psychologist told me that it was completely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. And something in me knew that even if they managed to convince me that it was crazy and that I should finish medical school and then do whatever I want, I would still leave and go to England to be with Andrew. Somehow it wasn't even a conviction. It was like, this is what needs to happen. You can convince me, no problem. I'm easy, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the state I was in at the time.
Amir, you touch on so many wonderful pieces there, and one really is almost an archetypal challenge that many people have when they have a unitive and awakening experience, some kind of a non-ordinary experience that really profoundly rocks their world and changes their world. And the challenge then arises of how to walk the two worlds, how to be in the so-called ordinary life and then be in this other realm, this other state, way of being that has been opened. And there in your story you speak of a choice point, and for you it was clear and obvious where you had to go. And I wonder, having made the decision for yourself many years ago, and now having spoken with so many people who also have made that choice very clearly, is there anything you would say to people who are that medical student that you were in the 5th year, who are at that choice point in their life when perhaps they don't have a full conviction that this is the way they're going to go, but they're in the grapple and the struggle of the ordinary and the beyond the ordinary?
Well, Nicole, you're touching here on a question that I feel is as relevant to my life today as it was 30 years ago, which is how to live in both worlds at the same time, in the dimension or realm or state of unitive consciousness, which is always present, is always accompanying us, doesn't matter how much attention we give to it, but it's always available, always present in our awareness. And living in the world of multiplicity, time, space, relationship. And you know, I think that that's the life of a mystic, is living in both worlds in parallel at the same time. And to me, it's always constantly asking the question of how to bring those two together. And you know, for a good chunk of time, 22 years of my life, when I was in a spiritual community, I had a very clear answer. And you know, kind of, even though that answer was a constant exploration, but it was within a context of what we called evolutionary enlightenment, which is how to bring together spiritual enlightenment, which is a concept from the East, with the understanding of evolution of consciousness, which is a Western concept, and how to make that real in our own lives. So there was a framework which kind of was very helpful and very supportive for the ongoing exploration of how that meeting is expressed in each of our lives and in our collective lives as a group, as a society. So there was a framework there, a conceptual framework, which helped a lot. I left that framework about 11 years ago now, but the question is as much alive in me, and is demanding my constant openness and being in a state of receptivity to discovering constantly how the two worlds or two dimensions come together, and how unitive consciousness can be expressed or is asking to be expressed in the world of multiplicity and relationships.
Mm.
So for me, that's really the question of my life, and I think of life, of human life.
And I love how you express there, so sorry to jump in, I love how you express there, you know, the different vehicles and vessels that can help bring those together and express that energy. So one of them there being a conceptual framework that help bridge those two at that point in time in your life to make sense of it. And, you know, as you say, you dropped it, and we can make use of certain vehicles at point in time. So some people will choose perhaps expressive artwork, others choose activism, conceptual frameworks, wherever someone is naturally drawn to go. It seems that we can find these methods or vessels to channel some of that energy that is moving through. And rightly, as you say, when it's time, it's done. It's done, and we move on.
Yes, I do believe that each of us has to find out the answer for him or herself. And, you know, of course, the religions and different traditions and different teachers give us more prescribed answers and frameworks. But even then, it's our choice. And it can be a very deep choice, which means that it feels like it's choiceless. But even what feels choiceless is not separate from our own choice.
Mm. Mm. I love those koan-like statements. They take a moment to settle. So, Amir, your story that you were saying there too, you share it very intimately and beautifully in your book, which I really enjoyed reading, Spiritual Transmission. And I'd love to open this part of the dialogue. The book, as I understand it, you went and you interviewed many leading spiritual teachers and thinkers about the very intimate relationship that occurs between two people, being the teacher and the disciple as such, or the guru and the student, however we want to frame that. And some of the challenges that can occur in such a relationship, which is an unusual one, isn't it? It's not our typical love relationship between two individuals in a lifelong partnership. as we
which
might typically think of it.
well, I mean, comparing it to a love relationship is a good starting point,
Okay.
because there is some overlap, I would say. Comparing it to a psychotherapist and patient relationship is also a good metaphor, and to a parent-child relationship is a good metaphor. So all these are kind of areas which have some overlap, I think. And in the teacher-student relationship, in the spiritual context, there is a whole area which is different from all those other types of relationship. And in my experience, this kind of relationship was, I would say, maybe has been the most challenging, the most terrifying, the most fulfilling and significant relationship of my life, including romantic relationships and including relationships with my parents and different significant figures in my life. So there is something about the relationship between a teacher and a student in the spiritual context which really touches the deepest, which works on the deepest parts in ourselves and is beyond them. I think that the teacher-student relationship something actually that it happened to me in one of the interviews I did. I interviewed a few times and also spent some time with an Advaita teacher by the name of Muji.
Oh, one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Amazing human.
So I also interviewed about 10 of his students, some of them through Skype and some when I visited his ashram in Portugal. And I remember that interview. I was interviewing 3 of his students together on Skype, and I asked them, so what do you think that Muji gets from the relationship with you? What does a teacher need from the students? What is his motivation, for having students? Do you feel there is a mutuality there in some way between what you get from him and what he receives from you? And one of his students said, well, I can try to answer this question if you want to put it this way. And I said, wait. When you say if you want to put it this way, how would you like to put it? And she said, well, in all your questions, there is behind it, there is an assumption that we are talking here about a transaction between 2 separate individuals that receive something from one another. So there are 2 separate entities, and there is some transaction happening between them. And what happens in that transaction, what each of them gets from it, is what it's all about, is the nature of that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
She said, that's actually, I don't think I see it this way. To me, the meeting between a teacher and a student is a miraculous event that has a spiritual significance and potential for itself. In a way, the teacher and the student serve that purpose. It's not for them. They're both functioning to create something which is much greater than themselves and has much deeper significance for spirit, for humanity, than what each of them gets individually. Mm-hmm. So I just went, thank you. This is fantastic. I was so touched, by what she said. I still am. It's a profound teaching, what she said there.
Tell me some of the other main learnings that came for you from that project? If I understand, it happened over about 3 years, where you were in this deep inquiry over this transaction or this relationship, this coming together of two beings in a spiritual context. Yeah, what else arose for you in that you walk away with?
Well, I think one thing is that I didn't expect, when I started my research, I knew that this relationship, and that I'm powerfully pulled, attracted to explore it, and I had no idea what would come out of that. I just knew I want to dive into it. This is the most, actually, when I realized that this is what I want to do, is to explore it and possibly write a book about it. I was in a Feldenkrais class. I was lying on my back with my knees up in the air, and then it just came to me, oh, this is what I want to explore now in my life. And internally I was like, silly, of course. How come I didn't think about it before? You know, it was like, I knew that this was just the right thing for me to explore, and that I needed to dive into it as much as I could without really knowing what would come out on the other end, or who would come out on the other end. But after about interviewing, I think 40 or 50 people, something like that, I ended up interviewing about 100 people, teachers and students, and many teachers who spoke about their experience as students when they were students, which was really fantastic to hear. So after I did about half of those interviews, I kind of took a few days off, and I had all of them already transcribed. So I just read all the interviews I did up to that point. And I thought, okay, what is the juiciest, most interesting, most alive part in each interview? And I realized that it was a paradox that kind of came up, or some kind of unsolved dilemma or question that appeared during the interview, and that caused the interviewee to hesitate, contradict themselves, not be so sure, not have it all figured out. And I thought, these are the most interesting points in each interview. So this is what the book is going to be about. This is what I'm going to explore. Those areas which seem to me like are inherent, are integral part of the teacher-student relationship, are those paradoxes and dilemmas which not only I understood remain open by their nature, but actually the fact that they remain open is what enlivens and fuels the relationship and keeps it alive and interesting and productive and beneficial. And actually, the bottom line of my book, even though I don't think I say it very clearly, because I wanted the reader to come to it, is that it's good to keep those paradoxes alive. Don't rush to a conclusion. Don't fix anything yet. Try to keep it going for a while, and if possible, maybe forever. Because life is full of paradoxes and unresolved questions, and it's a good thing. It's not something we want to escape from or try to solve, in a final, absolute, this is it kind of way, because something stops, some dynamic and some aliveness actually stop when we come to a resolution of well, not necessarily, to be honest. I think that sometimes we come to answers, and that happened to me a few times in my life. We come to answers to big questions that we had, and sooner or later, we realize that new questions, fresh ones, bigger ones, were born out of the answer we came to. So sometimes it's good to come to an answer. I'm kind of contradicting myself, but who cares?
Part of the paradox.
So sometimes it's very good to come to an answer, because the best kind of answers are those that give rise to new, bigger, and deeper questions.
And so what are those questions that arose out of your inquiry? You had many answered through the big deep dive journey, and no doubt because you are open to living a path of paradox and contradiction, more questions must have arisen. Did they?
Well, I can tell you what questions are very alive with me now, and two of them actually were born out of the book. I didn't write about them specifically in the book, and when I realized it, again, I did that movement of how, I should have really started with those questions. They should have been chapter 1 and 2 of the book, but I didn't. I kind of went around them, and so I'll tell you what they are. One is, what is spiritual transmission all about? What is actually being transmitted? Because it's not information. It's not a piece of knowledge. But something is definitely transmitted from teacher to student, and that, to me, that's the main event. There is I found, so that's the one question, and the other question has to do with the love between teacher and student, which I call spiritual love, which is different to any other kind of love. And I realized these questions kind of summarize, really, I realized everything I wrote about in the book. And I left, and I discovered them only after I finished writing the book, and after it was published, and it was like, oh no.
Well, maybe they're the next book after the dissertation.
Well, they are for the reader to discover themselves. And I found a beautiful metaphor in Judaism, in my own tradition. I found a beautiful metaphor to the question of transmission, which is that the transmission from teacher to student is like a flame jumping from one candle to another. So the candles have to come into contact with each other for the flame to be passed from one to the other. Yet each candle burns with their own flame, and what's transmitted is immaterial, is something gets ignited, the contact has to be made, but the flame, which is like a metaphor for spiritual energy or something which is immaterial, that's what gets communicated, or that's what gets passed on from teacher to student. So I find it a very powerful metaphor for spiritual transmission. And it leaves open the question of what is it, and it leaves us for, really, it's not an intellectual question. It's not something we want to write a philosophy article about. It's something we want to experience and explore in our own experience.
So it brings about the question of ethics, which I think your book raises well also. There's no doubt that it's a powerful relationship in spiritual transmission between two people, student teacher. And yet we have more and more cases that we know of where there have been spiritual teachers, if you want to call them that, behaving badly in some ways. So people who have, for example, built empires and then been very disrespectful, even abusive of those who have come to love and adore them and would do anything for them. And I imagine in your experience, you've seen this in many cases also, where there is such unquestioned devotion for a person, where someone surrenders themselves, perhaps even entirely, to the teachings and the will of another. And that is potentially a very dangerous thing, and it is potentially an enormous space for growth and development, depending on where that lands and how that unfolds. Could you speak a bit to that, Amir, especially for, and I've spoken with several people actually who have had these so-called bad experiences. They've been burnt. So this is happening, you know, out in the world right now. And I guess could you speak to that conversation a bit?
Well, first of all, I don't need to ask other people. I look into my own experience, and I was profoundly disillusioned or disappointed, and I would say burnt to an extent by the ending of my relationship, the breakdown of my relationship with Andrew Cohen, and I left. I wouldn't say in a particularly bad way, but definitely with the way you feel after a deep love relationship ends, and the promise that it held kind of falls apart, and a lot of my friends who were with me in the community left in a much worse way. Some of them are walking around carrying deep scars or burns for 20, 30 years now, and probably will some of them may end their lives with that unresolved. So I'm more than aware of the potential dangers of this kind of relationship, and also I'm very aware that I would say a good 90% of the teachers, of the spiritual teachers in the last 30, 40 years in the West ended up in a pretty catastrophical way, usually because of sexual abuse, or we can say sexual abuse, or money issues, or power issues. So obviously, being a powerful transmitter of spiritual energy or enlightenment or experience or understanding doesn't mean that one is necessarily psychologically and morally mature and or baked, fully baked. One can be very enlightened, as paradoxical and as uncomfortable as it feels to say that, but one can be very connected to the absolute timeless dimension and transmit that in a way that is unmistakable and that affects people who come into contact with them, and yet be morally corrupt or very confused and confusing, or just an abusive narcissist or sadist or whatever bad name you want to give it. But that happens quite a bit. So the first thing to say is that enter at your own risk, and enter knowing.
Right.
And if you're a reasonably mature and sane person, then the responsibility is fully on you, the student or the disciple, you know, and that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. I was thinking about it this morning. Because I'm going to speak in a few days. I'm going to be interviewed in Israeli TV about the difference between enlightenment and prophetic revelation, which the old Bible is full of. Yes, and so I was thinking about the concept of prophetic revelation, in which somebody comes down the mountain with the law, or is told, go and sacrifice your only son, or is told, like Jonas, the prophet, go to the city and tell them, that God's going to destroy them because of their bad behavior. And those people, what happens to those people? I mean, that message may be completely against their belief system, their moral values, their personal agenda, and what they want for themselves. And and many of them actually struggle against it and try to escape or argue the way out of it, and find that they have no choice but to obey. So, big question. What do you do when you feel that your heart tells you to surrender and submit and obey and do what you're told, whether by some voice, which is obviously not coming from anywhere and is not a voice as we know it, but some understanding or insight or inner / outer message? Or if your teacher tells you, that's what you should do, and everything in you says, no, that's wrong, I don't want to do that, that would be sacrificing my own common sense and judgment and moral values, and you feel compelled to obey. Oh my God, what a situation.
Really?
So, as you can tell, I have no answers.
And you mentioned that was in the conversation of comparing a revelatory experience with that of enlightenment. So how does it compare then? You've talked about the revelatory experiences and the challenges of that. How would that compare to enlightenment, so-called enlightenment?
Oh, okay. I'm spilling my beans here, but you're not here because the interview is going to be in Hebrew.
Good. So this is for all of the English listeners that don't speak any Hebrew.
Okay. So I can tell you my thoughts about it. I don't think I don't have an answer, but I can say something about the distinction I see between enlightenment and a revelatory prophetic revelation, which is that to me, enlightenment signifies or points at going outside or beyond the mind, which means you leave behind any reference point. Well, you don't leave anything. You're being pulled out of any of your reference point of thought, of language, of understanding, of time, of space. You find yourself in a state where there is only consciousness aware of itself. And that's the only thing that's there. And it's fully alive, it's dynamic, it's sacred, it's beyond any, these words don't even come close to what this is all about. We can't imagine it. It's beyond language, therefore it's also beyond our imagination, and we don't have any reference point for it, basically. Not in our consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, since you're out of time, out of space, out of mind, out of language, you don't really, there's not much you can say about it. So to me, the only thing that you can say about it, and a lot of mystics who come back from that experience say, it's ineffable, it's indescribable, you can't imagine it, nothing we can say about it would make any sense. And then they go on writing books about it and speaking about it for the rest of their lives, right? Mm-hmm. So there's something very paradoxical about saying it's ineffable, indescribable, and da-da-da-da-da-da, let me tell you all about it.
Yes.
So what happens there? How come people say it's ineffable, indescribable, and then say, and it demands that we, make this world the best we can, that we live in a moral way, that we are generous and loving and compassionate, and give our lives to making this a better world. How come? So my assumption, and I'm just kind of presenting it, it's really a question for each of us, but I'll say what I came as because I was asked to kind of deal with that question, so that's what I've been thinking about recently. I think that whatever we can say about what God wants from us, or what we come back from the cloud of unknowing into the world of language and relationship and time and space with, is what we discover when we come back. It's not something that was revealed to us on the other shore. It's when we come back to this shore in a state which presumably is fresh, full of wonder and awe, and aware of the mystery of life. And as we come back from that beyond human, beyond anything state into the world of time and space and relationship, we're in an open and receiving mode that enables us to see the world in a new light, and be open to some intuition or some understanding that I don't think comes from beyond. It comes from the best part in ourselves that are now open to the world and are embracing the world, and embracing not only the world, but the specific situation that we find ourselves in. For example, Moses coming down Mount Sinai, so he runs into this people. I think when he went into the cloud, which is what going in up Mount Sinai is supposed to symbolize, walked into the cloud of unknowing, and met God there, which met that which is beyond anything we can imagine or conceive. Then when he came down, all his history and his role as a leader, as a national leader, and a spiritual, religious leader, to this rabble that was worshiping the golden calf, right? And so he met that situation. He was in this open, vulnerable, awed and full of mystery state, and bam, there goes this crazy situation that he finds himself facing. So he responds to it. He responds to it with everything that he has, with his mind, with his imagination, with his moral stance, with his experience, with his sense of responsibility for humanity in general, and for this people that he just pulled out of Egypt 3 months earlier. And so he tells them what the right thing to do is, and what God wants them to do. And he uses the language, in that case, I don't know, ancient Hebrew, I suppose, that he's equipped with. So if he was a Viking or from a Zulu tribe, I guess he would use different metaphors in a different language. And if he was a postmodern intellectual, he would probably express his understanding and his insight into the situation that he was facing in a very different language. But he was a Hebrew, coming down the mountain, facing that rabble. So he responded in a way, in the language that I understood, with the metaphors I understood. He used the name of God to explain, in the language that they could relate to. And that was probably the most appropriate response for that situation, whenever that was 3,200 years ago or so. And I think that people at different times, in different cultures, and facing different situations, responded with the language and with the metaphors and with the kind of response that was appropriate for that situation. We've gone a long way from your question about why spiritual teachers get into trouble.
Well, I think though we've come right around into where you're currently at and going with Living Transcendence in your new study. And I really love the way that you articulate that, because for me the language I use there is agents of awesome. These people who have touched upon the great beyond, or whatever we want to call that, and come back with all that they have to meet immediately the world's needs as they see them, where they are in the world, with all that they are, in their own way, through their own personality, through the vehicle that they are.
Yes.
Is that what you understand by living transcendence? Is that what this new study and exploration is about for you?
It's definitely in that direction. I want to. I'll say a few things about the research about living transcendence, and maybe it will answer your question or relate to it. First of all, is that I make a distinction between, well, not I, traditions and researchers make a distinction between spiritual experiences and a state of enlightenment, of ongoing, stabilized, what Abraham Maslow called high spiritual plateau. In Japanese, it's the distinction between Kensho and Satori. Kensho being like the images of lightning, suddenly enabling you to see the scene, but then darkness comes back again. And you've seen, you know, now you know the landscape. Now you know where you are, and you have much better way of navigating your way around now that you've seen the scenery and you know what's around you. But you're still walking in a state of dark, relying on that lightning, what was revealed to you in that lightning. So that would be a kensho. And different traditions express that in different terms. And then you have satori, which is you see everything in daylight. There is no darkness again. You don't have to rely on any past experience. You don't have to rely on any memory or conceptual structures that you created when you had that insight or that experience. So I've had spiritual experiences or events of unitive consciousness which affected me very deeply and really transformed kind of the chemistry of my personality and my relationship to being alive. But to me, they were peak experiences. And when I read people who speak, you know, some of the great saints or luminaries in different traditions, I realize that they are not talking about having an experience. They're talking about being in an elevated state of consciousness or existential state in a way that is not my experience now. So I'm like, okay, so there's definitely further to go, and what better can I do in the rest of my life? So that's really my motivation for this research. Is I want to be in contact with, explore, be in touch with, and be open to transmission from individuals who are in that high plateau state, spiritual plateau state, for whom the awareness of unity or of reality or truth or whatever way you want to call it, the absolute, is an ongoing experience and understanding, and the way that they see the world when they wake up in the morning. They don't have to remember anything that happened the day before in order to see the world in that way. So that's what I'm interested in, and that's what I called living transcendence, as opposed to experiences of transcendence. So living transcendence means a stabilized, ongoing, day-to-day living experience, living state.
Yes.
And how do you explore that? So how does one go into exploring that, assuming that that's not currently my own experience? So I can't just look into my own experience. So for me, the answer is go and spend time with people who supposedly are an expression of that existential spiritual state. And that's what I want to do. And so I created this structure of PhD research that will
Fantastic.
enable me to spend time with those people and be open and receptive and inviting for some interaction and some deep spiritual and intellectual and emotional interaction with those people. And because so that's one aspect of what Living Transcendence, what the Living Transcendence study is all about. And the other aspect of it, which is a theme that has been going with me since I started my spiritual search some 45 years ago, which is the sense that that my spiritual journey is not the journey of this individual by the name of Amir Freimann. It's a human journey. It's a human yearning. These are human questions. They don't have much to do with my personality or my biography or the fact that that I have black eyes and I was born Jewish in Israel. That's irrelevant. So, or that my name is Amir Freimann, just as irrelevant. I mean, these questions and this yearning and this journey are expressed through this specific body and mind and cultural conditioning and psychological conditioning, which we call Amir Freimann. Okay, apparently that's part of the deal of being here. But since it's not a personal individual journey, or it's not just a personal individual journey, then my questions and my inquiry and my search and whatever I discover in the way, it doesn't belong to me. It's part of human knowledge, it's part of human search, and it's part of human meeting with these questions, engaging in those questions, and discovering whatever is to be discovered along the way. So that's why I write books. That's why I'm happy to be interviewed by you and talk about these things. And that's why I want to do this PhD research and publish. My intention is to publish the outcome, or the story, not the outcome, but the story of the journey, of my journey, and whatever I meet along the way, in a book, in a documentary movie, in a series of movies. I don't know, whatever way I can to share it with other people who are interested in those questions. And it's not really for me; it's for everybody.
Well, I thoroughly look forward to what emerges out of that process and the answers that come forth to the questions that are being asked. Yeah, Amir, we have covered so much ground. It's been deep. It's been beautiful. I thank you profoundly for this shared time together and this exploration. I love the way you present the path that you walk, and the openness to exploring this humanness, this form that we are, and this wild ride that we're all on. If there is one piece in a nutshell you would love people to walk away with, what would that be?
It's something I read of Einstein just a few days ago. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. He said, "I'm not that smart. It's only that I stay longer with the questions."
And he lived long.
So that's something I'm going to put on the door of my fridge. This kind of something. It's a good sticker.
Yeah. The bumper, it is.
Bumper sticker, yeah, whatever you call it. So staying with the questions and following the questions and allowing the questions to remain unresolved, but very alive, very present, opening you up to meet whatever comes in your way. That would be a good way of going forward.
Well, Amir, as an agent of awesome in this great human family, thank you for holding and creating the questions so that we may probe and seek and understand. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. Beautiful.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good luck with the rest of the project.
Thank you. Bye.